you're not surprised. But here it's becoming so hard now. Like, it's becoming normal here.
Should I stop it?
Oh, you started it? Okay.
Yes.
I just have a lot of people.
All right, folks, good to see you. Welcome back again. Thank you very much for being part of the morning session. There are still people wandering around. They will be coming, joining us, but let's keep ourselves doing scheduled. We have a very interesting presentation now, which kind of looks at home and comes from a journalistic point of view, and a journalist himself looking at his own practice, his own industry, and seeing how the blurring of journalism to commentary, where is commentary starting and where is commentary ending, and that is an interesting examination that my colleague, Professor Michael Rizzo, who is a journalism professor here, he will do. So please, Joe.
Thank you, Basilio. Thank you all for being here today. I do need a little bit of technical help here, Basilio, to get my slide on that screen, or that screen, any screen.
You need some assistance. Hey, how are you? So good to see you coming
So, Eric Sevareid gained his greatest fame in the 1960s when he regularly provided 2-minute editorials at the end of Walter Cronkite's CBS Evening News newscast. The commentaries garnered him the nicknames of the Gray Eminence and Eric's several sides. He ascended from being a reporter to the license that no other grunt in the industry could wield, a license to comment. In 1966, to a CBS Evening News audience that typically ranged from 27 to 29 million viewers, he became the first prestige TV correspondent to challenge U.S. policy on the Vietnam War. Howard K. Smith, in the same era, regularly appeared on ABC News nightly newscast, offering commentaries on the news of the day. In an editorial that was broadcast in 1968 after the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, Smith said, there exists only one real alternative, that is to escalate, but this time on an overwhelming scale. It was an emphatic statement of the reporter's opinion on what should be done. What made both of these men of note to the viewing public was clearly their opinions. They sought to present not only just facts, but they wanted to give their thoughts, their criticism, their suggestions, and their sentiments. But by using a graphic that displayed the word commentary, and this is a little dated, but you can see it in the upper left-hand column, left-hand side of that image on your left. Smith and Sevareid spoke on the broadcast, or the news anchor introduced them, saying that they would be giving commentary, so viewers understood what was unique about this portion of the newscast that was provided to them. Such is often not the case anymore. Now, the Society of Professional Journalists, in their Code of Ethics, contains a section entitled Seek Truth and Report It. An explanatory paragraph for this section explains that ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. In this section, it also directs journalists should label, advocacy, and commentary. What makes this directive so important? A member of the ethics committee said this: "It's important to differentiate between opinion and impartial news coverage. More and more news organizations, though, seem to blur the lines between the two. The public has been a bit befuddled. Many don't distinguish between the newspaper's editorials and regular news reporting. And there's increasing evidence that members of the public gravitate to news sites with points of view only that they agree with. They're looking for affirmation rather than new information that might challenge their belief. But even advocacy and commentary have an obligation to be accurate, and it needs to be identified so the public doesn't confuse it with what should be an impartial, accurate approach to the events of the day." Now, a Pew Research study of 3 days of programming on Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC in 2012 found that CNN spent 46% of each day providing opinion versus just reporting. Fox, 55%, the same thing. MSNBC, 85% of their programming was opinion as opposed to news reporting. Pew went further. It showed that opinion dominates each day part of the cable news network. From 6 to 10 a.m., it's 56% of the time for the networks combined. Noon to 3, 59%, and 6 to 11, 70% of the time it was opinion. These findings represent that the type of shows typically found on these networks are effectively interview and opinion shows like those heard on talk radio, except there's almost nobody calling in. Maybe a guest, but not regular listeners or viewers. The Associated Press makes clear in its standards and practices procedures, anyone who works for the AP must be mindful that opinions they express may damage the AP's reputation as an unbiased source of news. They must refrain from declaring their views on contentious public issues in any public forum, whether weblogs, chat rooms, letters to the editor, petitions, and other things that they mention. The Media Insight Project concluded that one possible explanation for an overall decline in trust by the public is that parts of the media, especially TV, have blurred the distinction between opinion and straight news reporting. What is the mindset to promote this blurring in today's media environment? Well, David Bauer of the Associated Press said this: "The cable networks have turned politics into primetime entertainment. And it's been both great for business and polarizing. Fox News Channel from the right, MSNBC from the left are frequently the most watched cable networks, but with the opinion shows so successful, shouting," that's a lot of S's in a row, "what you believe tends to pop more than the facts of the story. It's become harder to suppress those identities. And even when different sides are given, the hours are filled with opinionated people giving their takes." Well, let's go back a few centuries to this fellow called Soren Kierkegaard. So, Kierkegaard's aesthetes are people with spirit and intellect, who live for themselves, make life imitate art, judging it by the aesthetic criteria of beauty, interest, and novelty. The rewards for them are an interesting life, an active imagination, and the possession of an ironic detachment. The important thing is not right or wrong to him, but the interesting or the boring. In his ethics stage, Kierkegaard also posited that that person lives to serve others. The rewards of living this way, his ethical stage, are a sense of self-worth and nights of blameless sleep, though neither are assured. Well, that could happen for a lot of reasons, but let's just stick with that. Living the ethical life can end in infinite resignation and a despairing sense of the gap between what is and what ought to be. The ethical person appears to an absolute standard of conduct, and identifies with it absolutely. This gives him or her a solid and predictable ethical self. So how does it combine with our discussion of journalists? As esteemed, some modern journalists, because of their exposure on television, radio, and the internet, have become celebrities. Some of their status is from their reporting and their interviewing. Some is for powerful comments and analysis that they make on high-profile media platforms. They actually seek out those platforms in order to present their views. As ethicists, some modern journalists adhere to more traditional policies of their work. Their stature is in the output of their work as reporters, not their celebrity status. They rarely seek the limelight beyond their byline or straightforward communication to audiences by simply reporting the facts when they do appear. In reality, many modern journalists are likely a part of both of these spheres of existence that Kierkegaard proposed. Part of this mix is the changed nature of the media environment. Technology has made it easier and almost forces journalists to participate in social media. Those tweets and posts deliver condensed stories quickly, typically without the space or breadth of context, and almost inviting dictums from the reporter that call for snap judgments or opinions on what they see as happening at the event that they are covering. The modern journalism landscape is also a consolidated one where newspaper, online, and broadcast entities may be all one part or a part of larger conglomerate corporations. Different organizations also work out arrangements where their reporters routinely appear on other news media platforms. These arrangements, whether it's vertical integration in one company or a feeder system for different voices from different organizations, expose more and more journalists to new and broader audiences and establishes some journalists as sought-after media stars who are photogenic or very capable communicators. Back to Pew. A research study they did in early 2018 found that 29% of those surveyed had no or little trust in the news media versus 21% who had a lot. Further, a Gallup Knight Foundation survey found that over the last 10 years, trust in the news media had decreased by 69% among the U.S. adults who were polled. The reasons most often cited by respondents, 23% said that one-sided, unbalanced, or incomplete reporting causes them to distrust news organizations. 16% says news grounded in opinions. That's the second highest result. Grounded in opinions or emotions were the reason they distrusted the media. 14% politically or partisan-focused coverage caused them to lose that trust. So what can we conclude from all of this?
I guess
Let's go back to Mr. Cronkite. He was the anchor of the CBS Evening News from 1962 and 1981. He is considered by many the paradigm of broadcast news professionalism and proper journalism. In a 2009 interview, Cronkite said, "Good journalism was honesty, fairness, truth, and totality of the story that's presented, telling both sides of a controversial story. All of those things," he said, "should be practiced in every story that is carried on the air as they once were in better newspapers." It always comes back to newspapers. His comments, by the way, you didn't hear me say, include the need to express an opinion on any story. And Cronkite was known for keeping his opinions to himself. There was one notable exception for him. After traveling to Vietnam in 1968, he returned to his anchor seat and proclaimed to the nation that the war was unwinnable. He had departed from his usual objectivity, declaring that the war could end only in a protracted stalemate. This is what he said: "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to the pledge to defend their democracy and did the best they could." His opinion actually helped turn many Americans from supporters of the war to opponents of it. And Lyndon Johnson is said to have told his staff, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." So can 21st century journalism regain the trust of the American public? For some in the media, they say there needs to be a road back to the basics. The approach of simply reporting the facts without any interpretation at all. You heard the Dr. and Dean Gerstner say this morning, those 5 W's that he learned as a student. Just report that, the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why, and nothing else. But Canadian and American ethicist Stephen Ward says the news-consuming public plays a role too. It is so important to understand people of other perspectives, he says. If we stick with the media that just reinforces us, we don't get that other perspective, he means, and that's worrying. These echo chambers, and it's been mentioned already today, echo chambers, are a cause from concern. News consumers who don't pursue more than one source of information risk being caught up when reporters stray from factual reporting to opinion reporting. The media can strengthen their own case for a diversity of perspectives on covering stories by espousing greater diversity in their ranks. This means not only diversity of gender and color, but intellectual diversity. It is in all three that fresh perspectives based on a variety of reporters' lives, learning, and experiences can open news organizations to fuller coverage of stories. Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel describe the importance of intellectual diversity in news organizations in their book, The Elements of Journalism, which I use as a textbook for my course, Introduction to Journalism, here at St. John's. They write, the ultimate goal of newsroom diversity is to create an intellectually mixed environment where everyone holds firm to the idea of journalistic independence. And they place a high regard on journalistic independence as a key part of what makes journalism work in our country. That independence is what provides journalists with the moral authority to be the watchdogs over those in power that the founders of the United States envisioned when they supported freedom of the press and the First Amendment to the Constitution. The RTNDA talks about ethics as well. But in the book Provocation, Spiritual Writings of Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard is quoted as this: truth is not a matter of knowing this or that, but of being in the truth. The SPJ Code of Ethics we mentioned has Seek Truth and Report It. Now you see on the screen the Radio and Television Digital News Association Code as their first guiding principle, truth and accuracy above all, followed again by that independence with transparency and also accountability of consequences. The majority of journalists pursue those goals in their work every day. What needs to be avoided are the distractions to both the journalist and the public of one person's opinion, which would be the journalist presenting it, done in a forum that can reach hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people, that ultimately draws more attention to the commentary than to the facts of the story. Thank you so much.
And now it's my pleasure to invite Carl Lappo from the Tarleton State University in Stephenville, Texas. And no, he will not talk about Beto.
Well, I actually have a Beto example, so I'm thank you very much. Give me just a second to switch my slides over. And we'll go from there. I apologize for going meta so early in the talk. Eventually, I'm going to talk about memes, so I have a meme that's, in a sense, about memes, in case you like that sort of thing. All will become clear, I promise, or at least I hope. I want to thank you all for allowing me to come to speak here on such an important and timely topic. I think, given Kierkegaard's emphasis on the truth, and his, I think, very sort of prescient concern about media, he's almost ahead of his time in advancing some of these worries about fake news. I think it's great that we've got a venue to get Kierkegaard people and journalists together to talk about these things. I'm going to go a little off script and pick up where Michael left off, because with the stage set so richly, how could I not? So two things from his talk. And then I'll say a word about Kierkegaard's authorial strategies that he himself used, and then I'll try to relate back to the memes that I and my co-author, who sadly couldn't be here, had prepared for you today. So we've got the spheres, or the stages, the aesthetic sphere with its love for the fun, the flashy, the interesting. And Kierkegaard thinks there's a bunch of different kinds of aesthetes. There's the aesthete that's just into what's pleasurable, sex, drugs, rock and roll. In Texas, we really like Whataburger, whatever sort of sensual aesthetic pleasures you might be into. Sort of curious what that would be in New York. I think the stereotype is pizza, but I imagine there are a variety of options available. So you've got sort of the immediate aesthete. You've got sort of the fancy, refined aesthete, who's in not so much to the pleasures, but to sort of to the pursuit of the pleasures. So we've got this lengthy and frankly terrifying text that Kierkegaard writes under one of his pseudonyms. Talking about anonymity earlier, Kierkegaard writes this pseudonymous text, The Seducer's Diary. And the point of the seduction that he describes in this text in painful detail is not actually seducing this woman is sort of the refined pleasures of the pursuit, not actually achieving this goal of getting with Cordelia. So we've got a lot of different kinds of aesthete on this Kierkegaardian account, and all of them Kierkegaard seems to suggest are somewhat lacking. We're supposed to realize this can't be all there is. You can't just go from pizza to opera to seduction to whatever the next big thing is. There has to be something more than this pursuit of the pleasurable or the interesting or what have you. And sort of a common feature of Kierkegaard's writings is that they function like mirrors. You read them and you see yourself in them. And I think there's a variety of aesthetes just to help sort of fulfill this role. If an ape were to look in a mirror, they wouldn't see an angel looking back. So Kierkegaard is writing so that you have this moment of self-recognition within these characters. So far, everything I said is pretty textbook. Here's where I want to maybe push it a little bit, and hopefully this will start a conversation about ethical journalism. I think Kierkegaard wants us to be dissatisfied with the ethical stage as well as the aesthetic stage. There are a lot of reasons why we might like the ethical characters as compared to the aesthetes. They're pro-marriage, they have jobs, they get haircuts, all of this great stuff that most of us probably would encourage, maybe if not for ourselves, at least for our students. But there's also a sense, in reading Kierkegaard's discussion of the ethical characters, that they sort of live lives of quiet desperation. Judge William, who's sort of the premier ethical figure, has this lengthy discourse about how great marriage is. And after you've read this very long discussion of the seducer's diary, you might be inclined to welcome this change of perspective. But if you read carefully, you discover, I think, that the judge also has an uncomfortable view of this kind of relationship. There's a passage where he says, marriage is wonderful. I've been married for all these many years. I don't really know what my wife looks like, my marriage, not the actual other person to whom he is married, but the marriage itself is sort of the thing that he values here. And, I haven't been married that long, but I think there's something profoundly wrong with that approach. So I think Kierkegaard's view is we're supposed to see ourselves in these figures, whether it's satisfying these standards or pursuing these pleasures and these other goods, and to see both of them as somehow lacking. There has to be something more than this. And where Kierkegaard is really good here, I think, is that he doesn't tell you what this sort of missing piece is. He invites readers to judge for themselves. He actually has a book entitled Judge for Yourself. And I think by painting these sorts of dissatisfying pictures, he's encouraging us as readers to make those judgments for ourselves rather than relying on someone else's commentary. Kierkegaard says a lot of nasty things about the news and about the media. Some of them are in my abstract, which is in your folders. I'd be glad to rehearse them if you like. Where I want to go now is directly to the memes, because I've had this sort of disturbing image, and I've got some more that I want to look at with you briefly. And I want to talk about how I think memes, specifically memes, these images that are sort of easy to generate and replicate and adapt and share, often via social media, etc. I think these can, in a sense, mirror some of Kierkegaard's own authorial strategies. And while they won't help us fix some of these ethical problems with fake news, etc., I think they can serve as a perhaps healthy response to the memes. So, why might memes be valuable? Well, first, they look an awful lot like Kierkegaard's writings themselves. They are often anonymous. You're not sure who originally came up with them. Kierkegaard himself used a variety of pseudonyms. So you couldn't tell often what Kierkegaard himself actually thought. You had to judge for yourself and do this work of interpretation to figure out, is this what Kierkegaard says, or is this what John the Silent says? Also, what's to do with John the Silent speaking? That's weird. That's a different paper. So I think Kierkegaard might actually approve of the anonymity of memes. He's often skeptical of the media because it gives this sort of anonymous, personal, disembodied perspective. He talks about the public as this monstrous abstraction, sort of co-created by the press. So that sort of anonymity seems bad, but he also has these passages about how the people who really have it together are unrecognizable. They're like the plainclothes policemen. One of his sort of heroic characters in his best-known book, Fear and Trembling, looks like a bourgeois tax collector. Like, you wouldn't think this person is remarkable at all until he goes on to talk about why. So I think there may be a positive aspect to the anonymity of memes. The memes I want to talk about specifically are what my co-author and I call sad memes. And for Kierkegaard, this is really important. He is a philosopher of emotion. It's one of the major themes of his writing. And he thinks that there are certain emotions like despair, like grief. Grief is maybe borderline to talk about it, like anxiety. These emotions that don't have a particular intentional object. So let me explain what I mean by reference to some news stories. If I read a news story about a shark attack, I might be afraid to go back in the water. So the fear in the case of this story has a pretty clear intentional object. I might become afraid of sharks, even though statistically I know better. Other sorts of stories might prompt these other sorts of emotions that Kierkegaard is particularly interested in. So, for example, a story in the news about the rising price of getting a college education, students, am I right, might prompt not fear of some specific thing, like a shark. It might prompt this anxiety about the unknown future. If I don't have sort of a determinate path to college, to whatever's next, well, then I'm anxious, but I'm not anxious about something that's there. I'm anxious about something that isn't there. So this sort of ambiguity of anxiety is what Kierkegaard thinks is really important. And with a lot of these sad memes, we see some sort of ambiguity in the anxiety or despair they're expressing. So the one we've got up now, the person is trying to make life choices, and they end up choosing memes because they can't choose among the paths that are laid, sort of traditional paths that are laid before them. I actually think this one doesn't fit quite as well because those paths do seem pretty determinate. This one might actually be closer to the shark attack news story. But my co-author and I did come up with a couple categories of memes that get at these more Kierkegaardian emotions of anxiety and despair. So this one is straight up about anxiety. I feel like I'm explaining a joke here, but let me talk through it briefly. This is on like a phone messaging app. The person says, "You have anxiety Prime?" Oh wait, I'm in Amazon Prime. And the second person says, "No, I've got them both. I have both the popular shopping application and I have anxiety." So we don't get a specific account of what the anxiety is about here. We just get, "Oh, I'm anxious." And this, I would say, fits the sort of form of anxiety that Kierkegaard describes across his writings. I'm anxious, but I'm not anxious about something in particular. Anxiety has a different intentional structure than fear does. Now, second category, I think even more to the point, and I think the second category can show how memes are often a response to fake news. Here we get the news story inside the tweet, but there it is. I'll give you a moment to read it and either laugh or cry, and both. In this case, the person has found their path through their education, hurrah for that. But there is at least one sense in which they might be worse off for it. So we get the anxiety, and once again, we don't get a sort of a clear path forward. It's not, I'm afraid of some specific thing. It is, I'm afraid of this debt, which is going to affect my life in all of these ways that I can't anticipate. So I think as much as Kierkegaard is skeptical of the news, he thinks the daily press, the daily paper, which showed up in his lifetime in Denmark, is the culprit. It always comes back to newspapers. As much as Kierkegaard is skeptical of this, and he likely would be skeptical of a lot of social media, I do think that there are sort of Kierkegaardian elements of our contemporary media landscape or media ecology. I know there are a few scholars who take this approach. There's a scholar who I cite in the updated abstract. I can get you the information if you want, that wrote an article in Artificial Intelligence Journal talking about how Kierkegaard might like Facebook, because instead of one public, we get a variety of different identity groups. I'm a little skeptical of that one personally, but she does have the idea that media could take on this Kierkegaardian component, which broadly I agree with. Patrick Stokes has a great article specifically on Kierkegaard and things like the Me Too movement, being publicly shamed online, etc. It came out in October. That gets at some very similar ideas. He's a great both public writer and scholar of Kierkegaard. So there are a few of us on the Kierkegaard side of things that are advancing these lines. What's distinctive about what Catherine, sadly not here, and myself have put together is we have this emphasis on these sort of characteristically Kierkegaardian emotions like sadness and despair. And I will close by giving you a particularly despairing meme, also about education. So the two features of this one, besides sort of the dystopian imagery and messaging that I want to point out. First, the caption at the top probably suggests that someone else is sort of reposting this. It's not their creation, but they're sharing someone else's image. The caption's scary how true this is. So there's the truth and the fear and maybe the anxiety all wrapped up into one. The other, I think, and maybe I'm afraid of this instead of anxious, I don't know. The other thing I want to point out, we circled or boxed in the lower corner, 250,000 people clicked like on this thing. And I know liking things on, I guess this is Instagram, may not be a particularly significant gesture, but I think it helps get a sense of the scale of phenomena like memes and how quickly they can sort of spread and be shared, etc. So I hope this, as with other new phenomena in our media landscape, are things we can apply, both things like codes of ethics, like the SPJ, etc., and our philosophical tools of analysis too. And I look forward to talking with you about all of these things in the discussion. Thank you so much.
Professor Von, you have to wait for Professor Von to come. He's part of our presentation. We more discussion. We speak with Edric, but he's in class. He'll be out in about 15 minutes. Okay. Can we do the discussion?
I mean, I think that would be fine. I think Michael or
If you don't mind, I don't
Yeah.
want to miss
So let us have
past presentation. He's in class.
Oh, no, if I could have brought my co-author, I would. She's smarter than I.
All right, so you heard about the process. Kind of, I'm glad that you fit it nicely in terms of picking up that you've left off, and there is some connection there. So please feel free to ask them questions, and we'll have this conversation on this. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Mike, which is, and you may also answer the question partially. In your discussion about the evolution of Cronkite and CBS News to news today, I have the feeling that there is a parallel happening in higher education, and I want your critique of my parallel. It's a question in disguise.
Sure what your parallel.
So my parallel that I suspect is that both higher education and news have made, in many cases, an unbeknownst to them transition from being the holders of facts to being the creators of context and meaning, because facts have become largely ubiquitous in access. And that has massively changed the real purpose of both news and higher education. But news and higher education have not necessarily caught up to the consequences of that transformation. Do you see that parallel, and how would you explain it? Because
Okay. I guess I would see it, but I'm not sure if I kind of maybe what came first. So was education through the, let's say, 1960s, the modern really mass media? We have now satellite technology, the ability to communicate much quicker in terms of news stories. Before that, even though broadcast television had been around since the late 40s, there was still a lag in terms of connecting people to tell stories. So was education up until that point, higher education anyway, more of just the sciences, more of just, the facts of
I think I mean something very specific which drives off it, which is that until the internet came along, the university had to be the physical, in its real brick and mortar sense, the physical repository of information. You had to go to a library to get a book, to get a magazine. You have to go to a class to get information from a lecture. You don't need to do that to get that information today, and that has fundamentally altered the purpose of the university. And my feeling, based on what you said about Cronkite, is that for many, many years, the purpose of newspapers and TV news and radio was to convey information that was otherwise inaccessible. Now that that information, as pure information, is largely ubiquitous, it seems to have altered in some fundamental ways the purpose of news.
Right, and I think I agree with you that it also has affected the concept of how to market and present the news. That there has been thinking among journalists that in order to stand out for what their story is, what the facts of the notability of their story, forget about notoriety, but notability of their story, that somehow they need to inject themselves, they need to present this opinion that, look, I really know a lot, and I want to tell you what I think about things. So that makes it stand out from just every other reporter who may be at the same event, providing that information to their audience in different cities, different networks, whatever, that they all reporting the same thing. So I think that may be similar to what you're talking about, that now how does the university and the professor at the university convey to those students, this is the value you want to get from us, as opposed to going to somewhere else where they may teach you the same basics, but we're going to give you some other value-added material, and that could be in my lectures, it could be in the service you do, it could be something else. And that's where I think there is that similarity and difference.
I feel like that there is a sudden recognition of, oh, we add value in new ways. And what I'm constantly thinking of doing your talk was actually John Oliver, and looking at this weird shift where comedy is becoming more serious and more factual than some news sources. And it's a very, very strange shift.
Okay, but except that, and remember the difference there is, and let's go back to John Stewart, who people in surveys would say they felt he was their news source, that they would go to him and he would tell them what was going on, but ultimately he was an entertainer. The same way with talk radio. It's called news talk radio because somewhere in that format, they actually tell you some news. They have breaks for an update on the weather or the traffic or what happened this morning with the transit problems in New York City yesterday. But the rest of it is talk. And talk is about entertainment that draws audiences. It's not to say, like talk, we are going to simply discuss the issues and have engagement with our audience about here are the facts, the bullet points, and then you can tell me your thoughts on it. You're giving me the opinion as the caller. No, it's mainly the host giving the opinion, driving that discussion.
But Cronkite, for example, was that way, I think. Like
Cronkite
was a conveyor of information.
Right, and the format was different. I'll also mention this, that if you look in research too, and you mentioned it earlier, that era, there was so much limited, so much less of network news, of, their television stations, but even they did less news than they do today, which is on at 6 a.m., goes to 9 a.m., 4 p.m., goes to 11 p.m. This is regular broadcast stations. So the impetus there was in order to keep advertisers from feeling like we are going to be connected with somebody who is controversial or is opinionated, and that might drive some people away from our products. They were more even keeled. They had more feeling that we need to be more judicious, more ethical, more balanced, unbiased, just straight reporting. But yes, that was the concept of the time that we are adhering to, as he even said himself, those fundamental ethical standards that were done in the newspapers before him. Now again, he didn't go that far back, because as you also heard earlier today, right, in the 1900s, 1800s, there was sensationalism, there were stories made up. We went to war in this place in Havana because of what they said was an attack, when it turned out it wasn't an attack, right? So there was newspaper work that was not as ethical as it could be.
But I would say that I'm really glad you brought up Cronkite. I don't know that I'd agree with you on the Vietnam, because the Johnson administration created quite a credibility. So when he gave that famous report during the Tet Offensive, his line was, hey, look, this is a big, long, costly war, and everybody had been told from the beginning it's nothing that wasn't home by Christmas. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. The one with him that was really, was at the end of his career with the Iranian hostage crisis, how at the end of the report, and that's the way it was, November 15th, blah, blah, day, that these Americans were held. But here's what I would suggest you might also look at here. In the days of the free networks before cable television, the FCC required news to be broadcast and adhered to what they call fair standards of journalism. They were subject to fines, they were subject to lawsuits if they didn't present both sides of the story, if they accumulated. Yet the three big networks, and this was CBS, ABC, and before Fox, okay? These networks lost money to cover the news and did it as a public service to get their licenses from the FCC. My understanding, and I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is that the commercial turning point was during the Iranian hostage crisis, when Kabul came on with an extra half hour and started to we'll talk to this guy and talk the kind of entertainment fluff and commentary that we now have. And he made a lot of money, and the ratings went up. So it also seems, and again, I'm interested to hear what both of your opinions are, because I think that, see, I'm looking at it from the political effects as a historian and seeing what I feel is the health of democracy, the health of the republic. It seems to me that three critical things happened here. One is, during the Reagan era, they get rid of the fair standards of journalism and news broadcasting. Next, during the Clinton era, the catastrophic Telecommunications Act, which of '94, which allowed these corporate mergers. I think in the election of 2004, 23 or 4% of their voters get all their news information from a Rupert Murdoch-owned product. And the third thing is, again, profit. One of the things is the old-fashioned reporting is costly. I think the funniest thing that I recall reading was when they were waiting for Pope John Paul II to die. He lived on and on and on. They were like piling up these incredible bills, because like they were renting apartments so that they could put their cameras, and he kept living and living and living. But to have a guy in the studio costs nothing. So the profit margins on these things, I think, are very good. But what's your take on that?
So I guess where I worry about a lot of these efforts to create standards, and this is my Beto example, so I'm glad to get this in. We've got conveying information, we've got commentary. And I'm worried about cases like this. Here's a statistically true fact. Texas is not a Republican state, it is a non-voting state. Statistically true. There are more non-voters in Texas than Republican voters. However, so I conveyed some information. However, this statistically true fact is one of Beto O'Rourke's talking points from his unsuccessful campaign to become the senator for the state of Texas. So how do we label this one? Does it get a commentary label? Because that's weird, because it's a fact, but it's also a fact that plays a specific role in the election campaign. So I worry about saying, well, we need other standards to help us distinguish the one from the other. I don't know if any of the experts here can help you with that, because I don't know how to.
Well, again, in terms of journalism, you present it as a fact, you attribute it to where the fact comes from so that people understand that information. And then to going back to what we've been talking about with echo chambers, and there will probably in some chambers decide that you are simply trying to mislead them, to provide fake information and not believe you no matter what. And others will say, there you go, that this group is trying to take over, et cetera, some of diversity, not diversity, but division between the believers and the viewers that try to see things different.
I'd just like to say something about what you just said, and that is that I don't think there's any kind of zero degree where a fact is not political. I don't think that exists. A fact doesn't speak itself. It is always quoted. A fact exists in the world, but we don't know the fact except through a discourse of someone who is speaking language. As soon as you are in language, then you are speaking from a point of view, and then you carry behind you all the luggage of your own identity, of your place in the world. We're at a university. I can't speak apolitically because I am a university professor. So all of that comes with what I say. I couldn't say your thing about Beto O'Rourke and not be political. I don't think it's possible. So I don't really believe that there is a zero degree where the fact shimmers in its own bright radiance, like something in heaven, and that we don't actually apprehend its political position. Facts are political.
So maybe if we drop the fact term, which I think sounds great, or replace it with a term like factish, as I think fetish and fact. That's Latour's, right? But if we leave all of our factishes aside, what if we just have evidence and argument?
You're just replacing one term by another.
Yeah,
You're
evidence
changing-
instead.
you're not changing it.
But I will say that does count, because language does count. And I watch news reporters all the time, and this, depending on the verb that you use, imparts something. So I think you're right that language counts for a lot, even if it is presenting a fact without actually doing commentary. And so I think to your point, Scott, is that you're right. Using maybe another term that people can understand that maybe is clearer to what you want to say. So I've had people say, well, don't reporters report the truth? And I say, well, yeah, we want them to report the truth, but I never want to say to my students, report the truth. Because then truth gets into this whole kind of gray area of what is truth. Punch is pilot, right? What is truth? But the point is, I say to them, report facts. But your word of evidence is good too, because evidence imparts that you have done some investigating and you have done some research, and now you are presenting things that are concrete. And even though you are not in the court of law when you were in the sphere of media, it is something of the same concept. Use the word details perhaps instead, because a detail is something that you think of as a concrete item of information that is true.
As
It's a
long as we
detail.
are in language, we can't get out.
Right, well, that's
We
what
are
I'm
in
saying.
a closed system. No matter what term you propose, that term is going to relate to all the other terms.
But that's,
I want to give you an example.
oh, yeah.
When I was in another life, I was engaged at university, and students had a great thing they used to say about teachers that they didn't like. They would say, oh, Professor Brown didn't come to work drunk today. And that was a fact. Right? What am I supposed to do with it?
Right. I'm thinking about that one, but yeah, I just think.
You get one.
Yeah.
So tying together this concern about being within language and this concern we got a minute ago about sort of the purpose of the university, whether we're talking about facts or evidence or details, would you say that we are discovering these details, or is it the case that we are creating the details? my former institution had a billboard in town that was, X University, and the slogan was creating knowledge. And I always thought that was provocative because creating knowledge versus discovering knowledge, I think, is a pretty important distinction. And
Which do you think is true?
well, if we follow your line and we can't get outside of language, it has to be created, right? Doesn't it? I see you disagree. You want to jump in?
I mean, creating knowledge is almost, I don't know, I just feel like especially when I was an undergrad, I was more discovering my, thoughts and opinions on certain subjects that were already there. So my thoughts and opinions on, Plato's philosophy versus Aristotle's philosophy. That was already there. That was already created, but I was discovering that I had opinions on it that I didn't previously have. So I think it was more of a discovering knowledge rather than creating knowledge. I think creating knowledge means that you're just creating everything that the student is learning, not showing them what they could be learning from.
Let me just say something about that. There's a very famous statement by Kierkegaard who said that at one point, I hope everyone knows who he is. Borges said at one point that the most powerful influence on Shakespeare was Freud. Because in fact, every period invents Shakespeare. Every period creates Shakespeare. There is no urtext that shimmers in some great place that is the essential Shakespeare. That's just a dream of the Western world, that this thing exists. It doesn't. I mean, we create knowledge. In fact, we do.
That's Joseph. Yes, I actually agree that everything that we say has some political undertones, but I believe that to get the facts, we could all bring it down to the various things. I'll give you a practical example of what I read here in the States. Listening to news has been very annoying. If you're listening to some major networks like CNN or MSNBC, and I'm very grateful for the website that confirmed my saying that they all have their biases. But if you listen to the BBC, you listen to Fox, you listen to CNN, there are different ways that they speak the truth. And we have to use language, but they can always bring it at the various minimum the opinion. So I wanted to ask, don't you have regulatory bodies that can way back again, we go back, regulatory bodies that can make sure, yes, that can make sure that the facts are represented more than the opinions. We cannot take away the major networks from saying their opinions, but to reduce it to the various minimum. Because sometimes it can be very annoying and misleading when you hear the various points of views of these
But let's remember too, so that we're not in an environment where we simply, though the internet could provide kind of what you're describing, just think of a website that simply gives bullet points of facts. It's statistical material, it's agate of type that just gives you the facts of the story. There's no writing, there's no storytelling. We are in a world where our media entities are for-profit entities. They are there, even at NPR or even the BBC, which gets more public funding than any, I think, source here in the United States. We do have NPR and other publicly funded broadcasters, but they're not as well supported. But the point is that they are aiming to get audience, and that audience helps them get other funding, gets other supporters, followers, audiences. So there's that combination of not just telling the facts, being entertaining, telling it in a way that's dramatic. Think of watching some long form programming like 2020 or some other shows. They use music, they use drama. Now those are all good forms of writing, nothing wrong with that, but they do it in a way to pull that audience in. So it's very hard to kind of just give the facts and then wonder, well, why is anybody watching? Because you're not making it entertaining, and that's what the audience now expects in our world. Tell me the news, but make it entertaining. I'll even mention one other thing, and I'll let go because I know Rich is here. Local television news was pretty dry, like Cronkite, up until really the early 70s. And then there was one famous news director, and I'm forgetting Al's last name, but he created what was called eyewitness news. And he actually aimed to change the format of these shows from a single anchor, usually a white male, older white male, to tell you what was going on. And now he involved other women, he involved other people, and he encouraged them to chat, to talk as if they were neighbor to neighbor, and to make fun of things, and to give, in effect, some commentary. And that attracted viewers. What happens now is now everybody starts to follow that, and you have more and more local news shows simply doing that kind of newscast, where there's more interaction. So,
Thank you very much. And now let's.
Edric's Fondelier is here, who was a duty bound, finished his class, and came running here, still catching up his breath. It's a collaboration with our other colleague, Mark Cusack. So please, the power of perspective on true and false rhetoric.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Please give us a brief moment to hook up our projection. Is tech support in the house by any chance?
What's that?
Who are your assistants, please? We would like to switch things in mine or
Oh, yeah, that's my assistant.
prefer to use mine or that. You know, they say that. So. Are you ready?
Yeah, you're all good.
Sorry.
Okay. I have everyone's attention. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. There are a lot of us on stage, and the reason is profoundly simple. We began doing something like any good academic that we thought was going to be really easy, and it ended up being so complex it's not done yet. So I'm sure you've encountered this before. However, in the course of that process, we've come across some very peculiar models and problems that we want to share with you. So this is not a presentation of finished work. It is a presentation of a work in progress, and a presentation that hopefully culminates in a request for ideas on your part, and an exploration of what might be. What I'm going to do, I'm Professor Mark. My last name has too many consonants in a row to pronounce. This is Professor Edric's, and this is Rosalie. She was our assistant in this process as well. I will speak briefly first, and then Rosalie will explain a part of what we began looking at, and Edric's will finish by explaining where we're going. I want to begin by fleshing out the fundamental problem that we encountered. And to do that accurately, I have to go back a little bit in time. About 6 months ago, I was doing research for a friend of mine on a very weird topic in hedge funds, which has nothing to do with rhetoric, but actually does. The topic was on something called skew. And skew in economic terms in real estate markets Think of it as a measure of the variance of variance. So if you look at a stock market and you say, oh, today the stock market is up 20 points, tomorrow it's down 20 points, next day it's up 40 points, next day it's down 40 points, right? That's how much it goes up and down. You can measure the variance in the market from day to day, week to week, month to month. However, you can also measure the variance in the variance itself. How often are there these massive outliers? The stock market plunges 1,000 points in a day, or goes up 1,000 points in a day, right? So skew, as a concept in economics, is a measure of the variance of variance itself. And we said, this is interesting, because it turns out this is also probably true in political rhetoric. If we look at how politicians speak, if we look at how communities create discourse, there are going to be natural cycles of variance, but there are also going to be huge variances in the variance themselves. And if you look at, for example, US society in the past 100 years, we might look at our current president's attempt to pack the Supreme Court and say, God, that's terrible. But it happened in the 1930s as well. There was a period of time where for 14 years under FDR, whether you're Democratic or Republican, we had the beginnings of something that looked a lot like a totalitarian state. And we had at that moment in time a variance in the variance of rhetoric itself. It wasn't just that there was a political fight, the extremes of that fight began to emerge. And the question that we asked ourselves was, is this a predictable thing? Is there a way that we can analyze the nature of rhetoric itself in public discourse, that we can break it down and begin to say, hey, maybe there is a predictive model where we can begin to analyze the texts of public discourse and say, in the future, this variance in variance might occur. And we developed a model that at this point is a work in progress. And that model is one where we have two forms of rhetoric. We have rhetorics of complexity and rhetorics of false binaries. So what are these two? Our objective, right, was to find out what the analog is in an economic sense in politics of skew, to develop a model that consistently identifies rhetorics of complexity versus those of false binaries. What do these two mean? Well, rhetoric of complexity, a public discourse by an agent of power. We're going to use Bourdieu's field theory. We'll explain in a minute why we're using it and how we're using it. That acknowledges the fuzziness of factuality. We talked about something being factish a few minutes ago. This is an incredibly relevant term, right? That facts aren't just facts. Facts are always embedded with some meaning given by some actor. So rhetoric of complexity is a public discourse by an agent of power that acknowledges in public the fuzziness of factuality with respect to a particular domain of discourse. We can contrast this to a rhetoric of false binaries. So a rhetoric of false binaries is not one where a politician says this is true or false. It's one where a political actor basically frames facts as being arbitrarily more true or more false than they really are. They exaggerate the degree of truthness or the degree of falseness. Why do they do this? It benefits them. Right? So here are two examples of what we consider to be famous or relatively famous rhetorics of complexity and rhetorics of false binaries. Okay? Presidential candidate Donald Trump, in announcing his candidacy, and I quote him, right? "They are not our friends, believe me," he said, before disparaging Mexican immigrants. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Okay? These words by the candidate, President Trump, are a great example of a rhetoric of false binaries. He's purposely exaggerating the truthiness or falseness of statements as a way to acquire power. As a contrast, here we go. Rhetoric of complexity. This is from the inaugural address of President John Kennedy in 1961. Right? Kennedy said he was speaking publicly at the inauguration to the American people, but because it was broadcast internationally, it was really a speech to the whole world. He said, finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request. It's an amazing phraseology. He is not calling out an enemy. He's not saying to the nations that are against us, to our enemies. The phrasing itself is so particular to those who would make themselves. They are not yet, they may not be, but who would make themselves. It's a remarkable example of a rhetoric of complexity, of a figure in public discourse acknowledging the complexity of factuality. So we said, well, these are clear examples. Can we develop a model to predict this, to classify this in a more automatic way, given how many public speeches there are, given how broad public discourse is, how many thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of public text become available literally every single day? Short answer is not yet, but so we're using as our model for analysis a model called Fields of Power by Pierre Bourdieu, classic French sociologist. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, the statement stands for itself. I will say what is significant about it. What Bourdieu said in a nutshell is that we can analyze an agent. So an agent is anyone that is seeking to exert influence or power in a certain place. Place is a concept. Place is not New York City. Place is the place within which that agent happens to act. The very fact that I am here in front of you and that you are sitting and listening to me is an example of a field of power. The minute that Mike stands up and I sit down, we are also exerting a game in this field of power. The fact that I'm here with Edrix and Rosalie. Rosalie is on stage today, right? She'll be in the class tomorrow. So, well, Monday or Tuesday. But we are acting as agents in the field of power. The field of power is St. John's University. And we can acknowledge the fact that our positions in that field of power change based on how we say what we say, on the meaning that we give to certain ideas, concepts, and phrases. So we tend not to think of universities as fields of power generally, but we can think of any institution created by humans as an invention and as a technology. What does that mean? I'm going to be very specific in my language for a second. A university is a technology. So is a political institution, so is a country, so is a concept of citizenship. These are all technologies in the Foucault sense, technologies of power, right? What do I mean by this? I mean that any institution that humans make, humans can alter. Any institution that humans make as a way to distribute and control power amongst themselves, right? So we can view it as a technology, much like a cell phone is a technology. It's an instrument to create and control power. So we're going to use Bourdieu's field model. And there's another quote by Bourdieu that discusses our rhetoric of complexity versus false binaries, right? So Bourdieu basically says, right, that in a field of power, in this space, every position is one that is constantly jostling for power, constantly adjusting itself. The fact that I'm sitting in front of you today, in perhaps unknown to all of us, in some minimal way, will alter my power to you and your power to me. The fact that you're going to ask me a question in 5 minutes may alter your field of power, your exact choice in how you ask me that question. Do you ask it in a way that's, proper or improper? Do you ask it boldly or quietly, right? Will alter in some way your power relative to me, my power relative to you, and your position relative to St. John's University or your own university at the same time. So it is a constant dynamic phenomenon. And all of us as agents have varying degrees of power. So there is an ideal state. And that ideal state, this is a misspelling, sorry. These fields of power that Bourdieu constructs are almost always hierarchical. There's always going to be some power structure that they reside in, and that structure will not be symmetric. Symmetry is an ideal, right? If we think about this truly, a truly symmetric field of power is one where everyone has exactly the same influence, exactly the same knowledge, exactly the same abilities, exactly the same capacities. This does not exist in the real world. We will always have some measure of asymmetry. So asymmetry is normal. Symmetry is an approximate ideal. We can strive for it. We can try to create ways to flatten hierarchies. We can never really achieve it. So we can look at this and say, well, all public discourse, Any rhetoric made in a public space by a politician, by a newspaper, by a media agent, is an attempt to change in some microscopic way that balance of power. And the question that we're faced with now is, do facts matter in that context? This notion of meaning is more significant than it may first appear in the context of truth. Truth, or what is true, is often confused with what is factual. These are not exactly the same things. Do facts matter? One of our conclusions: a fact has no meaning behind it. I'm going to read this very carefully. It is a statement of an observed and/or documented and verifiable human action, or an action or change of state within a natural world or human world. A temperature recording of a thermometer. The temperature in this room is 74 degrees. This is a fact. We only care to ascribe a qualifier to that fact. We care to say the fact is true or false when we decide to bestow meaning to that fact. When we speak of things as being true or false, we often forget this distinction. The only reason we use that qualifier is because using it is a form of power. To make the transition from the temperature is 74 degrees to it's 74 degrees because of global warming. This is a transition from a fact as a fact to something being true or false. A temperature reading by itself is a fact, but it becomes true or false only when it is used by an agent, climate scientist, politician, person in the media, for example, versus a child. Imagine a child saying exactly the same thing and making the same error. Imagine a child misreading a thermometer. A child says, "Mommy, temperature is 48 degrees. Someone else does it, it matters tremendously because they may do it in a way where they're trying to prove a point about something. So it only matters in trying to defend a position about, for example, in this case, global warming. That change of state from a fact to a truth or falsehood only occurs when that fact takes on some meaning for an agent, and the agent can use that fact to attempt to alter a balance of power. So we've developed a model of rhetorics of complexity and false binaries. That model principally has its roots in Manichaean dualism, which Rosalie will very happily go over.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Rosalie, and I'm a mentee of Dr. Mark. And thank you, Dr. Mark and Dr. Edrics, for letting me ride your intellectual coattails of wisdom into the symposium today. Appreciate it.
So the work is yours.
Thank you. So just to give a brief history of Manichaeism first. So Manichaeism was created by a Persian philosopher in the 3rd century because he felt that the prevailing religions at the time, they didn't address what really needed to be. So he posited that the world could be plainly divided into 2 planes. There was the good and there was the evil. There was God and there was Satan. And he postulated that every event that occurs in the world is catalyzed by and a product of this battle in this duality between the good and the evil, and that it was our responsibility to bear our labors and the fruits of our labor on the side of advocating for that good. Now there is an inherent power structure here. And when we take Manichaeism and set it forth into discourse and a rhetorical analysis, we find that it's really a push of ideological principles by a society or by the speaker of whom the society is advocating for. So of course, in a Manichaean framework, such a rhetoric would accomplish 4 things. One, it would posit what the speaker is trying to ascertain to be absolutely true, absolutely false, as the positive side of the dualism. And of course, conversely, there's the opposite of that, which is the negative, and that's the inherent evil side. But for our study, what we're looking at is the binaries aren't so much good and evil or good and bad, but truth and false, or fact and falseness, so to speak. Because fact and fiction are not comparable things, or no one would look and say, well, Mickey Mouse was a much better leader than Joseph Stalin. because we're comparing the fictional to something that was factual and something that exists in a very real way. And of course, there's also the consideration to the historical importance of the culture in which the discourse is located. So that goes back to that duality of this is the positive side of the argument, this is the principles by which my argument departs, and what I'm trying to set forth as inherently absolutely true versus what is not true. And all this is done through some sort of a unifying construct, whether it's political, philosophical, whether it's point of nationalism, something that really packages that in a way that we understand was trying to be really espoused and set forth as the true premise. So in terms of asymmetric agents and symmetric agents, in an asymmetric agent, we're reverting the Manichaean dualism as a method for acquiring power. So this means that fundamentally, there's one overarching power that functions as a hegemony, and there isn't any other room for another agent of power to assume any sort of power. It's really one-sided. And on the other hand, symmetric agents, we say revert to implicit acceptance of complexity. This means that not so much that there's a cult of egalitarianism, that power is distributed equally, but there's a rotation of such a power. And for our hypothesis and what we found in our examples through this study is that these asymmetric agents really made themselves evident through the construction of false binaries. And to operationalize a bit more, false binary is taking a complex idea and fitting it into an absolute construct of truth or falseness, reflective of Mani's idea of the good or the evil. And of course, the primary drive of someone speaking through either a rhetoric of complexity or creating a false binary is that of utility. What helps them to set forth and to propagate their power, what they're trying to accomplish?
I think that you're coming over
Yeah.
Actually, can you take this?
Yeah. Before Edward says what he did, right? Basically, what we began doing is experimenting. We began drawing on random data sets, speeches from Castro, translated into English, speeches from the Irish Parliament, Twitters from President Trump. We began looking for patterns where we could isolate and say, well, this is clearly a rhetoric of false binaries, clearly a rhetoric of complexity. And we ran into certain very interesting problems in trying to automate that process. And this is where it got really interesting and where Edward's going to tell us exactly what happened and why.
So when we first got together to talk about, can we computationally determine whether a body of text falls in one category or the next? Mark suggested, hey, maybe we can have something that, a tool that will allow us to predict whether or not it will fall in one category or the next. And I was like, whoa, Mark, this is a tall order, right? Most especially because fairly recently, this is dated November 5th, there are folks who are reflecting on machine learning and artificial intelligence as being the go-to tool, being more reliant on computers than human analysis. So the previous slide here is the sort of tool that those operating in the field of digital humanities, they're doing analysis of word frequency, word clouds, what have you, more effective measures to bolster or support the positions that they take when they offer an analysis of a particular work. And we really struggled with, how can we empower a computer to make a determination that this speech falls neatly within a false binary or a rhetoric of complexity. And so our thinking right now is that we use these tools to support human analysis to make a determination about seed texts, so texts that we think are excellent models of or examples of rhetorics of complexity or rhetorics of false binaries, and that eventually we would take this seed text and get a machine learning algorithm to then classify subsequent texts in much the same way that we use model images to help us determine whether or not this is a flower or this is a dog, or whether or not someone walking through a space in an airport is, facial recognition, is someone that we're looking for. But first and foremost, I would argue it needs to rely primarily on human analysis, and then relying on computational tools to offer an objective measure and support that.
So at this point, we've gotten to a point where we have a good framework, we think we have a good model of analysis, and at the same time, we recognize that it's very, very hard to automate parts of that process. We're hitting the barrier of meaning making, where really unraveling what makes Castro's speech a true rhetoric of false binaries is not simply word count or usage of the words enemy or true or false. It's a much more complex analysis of the context in which he happened to speak. And we're very curious from you about ideas or models for trying to find ways to automate or semi-automate that meaning-making process. So that's where we are today. I want to thank both Edric and Rosalie for their help. It was indispensable. And I want to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Could we invite suggestions, comments to support this wonderful researchers here? They are ongoing. Yes.
Sure, I have three. So the first is, I think that this rhetoric project would benefit from a strong theory of adversity.
Mm-hmm.
By that I mean, usually what we have are speakers, addressees, witnesses, and then eavesdroppers. And I think if you ran like a more rigorous structure of adversity, your model would be even more complex.
Adversity, you mean who it is addressed to?
Yes, but also right now, for instance, I'm addressing you,
Yes.
but everyone in this room is a witness to the exchange, and everyone who's going to be tuning in on YouTube later is an eavesdropper to the sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So once you start getting in that mode, you come up with a really sophisticated audience network. I think that could be worthwhile. The second thing is a slippage between is and as. The question was, is this a flower? Is this so-and-so walking through the airport? I get that, but the question that you're asking when you're talking about the rhetorical analysis of text is more of an as question. How can we interpret this? What can we interpret it as? And I think the difference between an is structure and an as structure is really important here. The is structure puts you, I think, on a dead end, in a cul-de-sac of sorts. But the as structure gets you into an entire, what I would call like hermeneutic phenomenology.
And part of the problem is that many of the common tools that currently exist for data processing of words are tools that exist in that is space.
Yeah.
Because you're making a determination with a certain measure of probability. Is this a rhododendron? Is this a phrase that is of this type? We haven't really designed, as far as I know, any kinds of inferential tools that are capable of doing that kind of as analysis, but that's exactly, although we never use it phraseology, it's exactly the problem we began hitting.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm talking about Heidegger here, the great as structured thinker without interpretation, right? But I also know a lot of rhetorical critics who are very happy that you haven't figured out an as application. Because that's their job, and literary critics, to analyze the text and figure out how to, I mean, they think of that as its own kind of art. And I just have one more, and then I'll leave it. We're back to this talk of fact again. And I actually agree with the point that was made quite a bit earlier. And just want to bring this back. I think when I hear the word fact coming up here, I think we're talking about what the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan would call the real. Something that is pre-symbolic, that resists symbolization. Saying that the room is 74 degrees is not the real. That's fully within the realm of the symbolic and its own kind of rhetorical text. Yeah, we can read it as metaphor. But I think it's, if there's a conceptual register at which to be working here, that might be it. Lacan and the real versus symbolic and their connection, that might get us through this fact dilemma that we find ourselves.
I mean, this is what gets fascinating, because our first line of inquiry was, is there a way to make a prediction? We were thinking about the rise in Poland of Kaczynski and Viktor Orban in Hungary, of Erdogan in Turkey, and saying, well, is there some way, if we went back and analyzed the speeches they gave,
is there a way that those speeches began to change from the moment they took office, where there is a predictability, where you say, oh, this is the false binary beginning to appear, this is the problem, let's address it. And that was sort of the great, like, if we could do this, that'd be amazing.
That understanding, unfortunately, usually only comes with hindsight.
Right, and this is why it was an interesting challenge that we say, hey, is there some way to restructure public discourse and rhetoric where that becomes a semi-predictable piece of capacity?
Sorry,
Yeah. So with your classification, you've got rhetoric of complexity, rhetoric of false binary.
Yeah.
Are those the only two options?
Those are the two only we consider the two questions. We can still on a spectrum. So in this moment, yes, but we are open to ideas about expanding the spectrum or altering the vectors.
Okay, make sure you say it's a spectrum, because
Yes.
otherwise your classification is a false
Right.
binary.
Exactly. That's very well said. No, we saw it as a spectrum, and that's also part of the challenge, right? Yeah, very well said. Yes.
One more piece. This is true. This picks up again a lot of the same issues, and particularly the remarks about Lacan. When you talk about fact versus truth,
Yes.
with respect to false binary,
Mhm.
and I'm not interested, particularly in the discourse of complexity or the rhetoric of complexity. But the rhetoric of false binary is really interesting because I think that what we really have to deal with here, when we say fact versus truth, to me, the truth is a convention. The truth isn't a truth, it's a truth convention. We're going to talk about that a little bit. So what are we really talking about when we use that word? Well, I think that what we really are talking about when we use the word fact is also a convention. It's a construction, or it's a social construction. It's not something that's given. So I think what you're really talking about is a fact convention as opposed to a truth convention, which really changes the range of what you're doing. That's all.
I think it's actually quite true. We began experimenting with this question of what are facts. We looked at it from really like a tabula rasa, and said, let's look from the ground up how we would construct a way to begin identifying the skew of measurement.
But don't you think that it's in discursive structure that we're going to find that answer? We're going to find that answer in some practical structure in which you recognize as factish.
And the problem that we encountered is that every time we could identify it, we could only say we knew it was another because of common sense reasoning about the context of what was read, as opposed to some specific quantitative element.
Common sense,
Right, exactly. And this is where it gets difficult. The AI is very bad at common sense reasoning. And we don't see a way that it could be better at it. And maybe it's not a bad thing necessarily, in honesty.
Anyone who would like to volunteer to join this enterprise?
I see you volunteering.
So,
Yes.
so I'm very intrigued by this conversation. So what do you make of the whole, the Trump and all facts and all right and all truth, the whole narrative and all this stuff?
If you ask me personally, I think that one of Trump's greatest successes is not that he has pointed out that there is fake news, it's that the concept of fake news has become accepted by so many people. It's a remarkable success on his part. And I think it's extraordinary the degree to which both sides of the media spectrum have, without any question, adopted his phrasing. It's absolutely astounding to me.
But isn't it also the case that what he's successfully done is reduced all truths to subjective opinions and say, well, the New York Times has its liberal perspective, the heck with them, and Fox News, he knows the numbers, he's got the data in front of him. Constructed to what they want to hear in their life. It's the tweet. The whole tweet is he's got what, 38 million people a day to take his tweets or something.
If you ask me personally, I will venture out of academic mode for 1 minute, and I will.
Yeah, but the question is about, is there truth in their facts? Because he's brought up this whole thing about alternate truth and alternate facts and alternate discourse. He basically said to the liberals, look, that's your opinion. He said, don't give us this stuff that it's climate change.
Yeah.
It's not science. It's not science. It's not factual. It's not research based. It's a liberal opinion. Yeah, you live with this, well, we've got our opinions.
He's repackaging. If you look closely, I think if you look at in 50 years, when someone, our children or grandchildren or us, if we're still around 50 years, if we look back at the history of the Trump administration, the Trump library, and have this massive database of tweets from hopefully 4 years and not 8, right? We'll discover, right, some amazing tendencies, and we'll probably discover that it looks a lot like the kind of debates that happened in the 1890s. And one of the things that and the reason I say this is very important, the political upheaval that we're experiencing today and the range of extremes that are manifesting. There was an excellent book written by a former head of the CIA, came out about 2 years ago, and he gave what I consider to be, not my idea, but his, the most brilliant analysis of why what's happening is happening. What he said was that there is a gap between technology and economic capability and governance. And if you look at what happened between 1880 and 1918, in that 30-year period, we had a shift as a society from agrarian to industrial, and that shift happened first economically, first technologically, and there was a lag of about 25 years before it happened in governance.
Right.
And we see the same thing today, that there's a shift from industrial to post-industrial and quote-unquote service knowledge economy, and that shift has happened technologically, it's happened economically, it has not yet happened politically. Because you have the best example, who is an Uber driver? Republican, Democrat, they belong in the union. A 1099 worker, where do they fit in that whole construct of existing governance? They don't fit anywhere. And we have this tremendous rise of a new type of economic force in the United States, and that force does not have a governance structure behind it. And the struggle we have between what we consider to be the far left and the far right, exactly the same struggle that happened in the 1890s. The election of McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan, the free speech and free silver movement. If you look at progressivism under Teddy Roosevelt, in those cases, it was nearly the same struggle. Sorry.
One last question.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
It's not a question, maybe a suggestion. I thought even Delos and Kautari's model of schizoanalysis could
What's it again?
schizoanalysis
Schizoanalysis.
could help in some way. What happens is if we have two types of positions, there are flows which they talk about, and you ride the wave. A politician may ride the wave of complexity, at some time may ride the wave of what you call a false binary. So, they talk about audipolization. We do audipolize and forget the other one. So what happens on the plane of immanence? That means the factors that gravitate me lead me to make a choice. Those factors need to be factored in, and only then perhaps the predictability of what I would say.
You mean you as a member of the public? Right?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm looking at what is happening, let us say Trump or my own Prime Minister Modi, what he would say, it will depend on the plane of immanence, using the Deleuzean term, in which it is intensive factors that are coming in. It is not simply linear, it is cyclic and complex, as you would call it, but we would ride that wave. I'm likely to ride a wave, and that has to be found.
This is a great question, because this sort of comes into our problem of finding skew. Like, if you remember, for example, when Vajpayee was head of the BJP, and he was super pro Hindu nationalist, right? And you had then afterwards you had to correct it backwards. But it didn't have to be. Like, the way history is today is not what might have been, right? And you can easily see, the BJP riding a wave and it becoming even more nationalist and moving to the next candidate for president, for example. So I think that there's a lot of ways where, the potential for skew exists. And part of what's fascinating is that we're really, really good at analyzing skew on stock markets. We're terrible at analyzing it in politics. It is absolutely fascinating that we have such a massive oversight in how blind we are to how big these invariants themselves are in the political sphere. We accept it as normal that we can analyze it in the economic sphere. It's a fascinating oversight.
With this oversight, I think we have because we have a fascinating conversation coming. We have to go to France in a few minutes. And so thank you so much
Yes,
for being
thank
part
you
of
for
this.
your
Thank you.
I'm going to request my colleague, This is going to be a fascinating conversation.
Well, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. Patrick Bissonnot is a veteran French journalist. His career has been in multiple media in France, primarily in broadcast news, and most recently, he was overseeing more than 1,000 journalists as regional director of France's 3 West television network. And William Chipola teaches media culture and society as part of the Institute of International Communication and the International Communication Master's Degree program here at St. John's. He's a former dean, he mentioned that just a moment ago, at New York University, and was president of the American University of Paris, where he met Mr. Bissonnot. By the way, Bill has a PhD in French from Johns Hopkins, so he'll not only be our host, but our translator. And please welcome both Bill and Patrick.
Just first, I have to ask you to apologize my bad accent, my very bad accent, and sometimes my search of words, but Bill will help me or correct me.
Also, in line with what Patrick just said, let me say that if he says something and you don't quite understand it, look at me and I'll repeat what he said. Because I know what it is. I just want to say also that this is a remarkable thing for me because Patrick and I met each other about 30 years ago in Paris when I was the president of the university, and he was looking for English instruction to apply for a job in New York. We haven't known each other since then because 25 years passed in which we didn't see each other. And I found him on Facebook. So, there are some reasons that Facebook should continue to exist, I suppose. No, I guess since that happened, it can disappear now. So when I asked Patrick what his subject would be for today, this is what he said. He said, my subject for today is what color is the White House? Or journalism in the post-truth era. So obviously, we're going to start this, by the way, this is going to be like some kind of talk show on TV where we talk to each other as though we were actually talking to each other, but it's all scripted. Okay? So it's totally fake, exactly like the name. But Patrick, what do you mean the color of the White House? Don't we all know what color the White House is?
Now, I'm not sure that, according to eminent scholars, the squirrel of the lawn see green, the squirrel, sorry. The flies in front of our office university black. And when he watches CNN, Donald Trump undoubtedly sees red. So, is it possible that truth could be a question of point of view? First, let me a word on the expression post-truth era, which is, for me, bizarre. One more post-something after postmodernism, post-industrialism, etc.
France is filled with posts.
Yeah. What was there before the post-truth era? Was it really the era of truth? The protocol of the Elder of Zion? The world and all wars? The Russian calling Stalin le petit père des peuples, the little father of the people? Colin Powell's model of the proof of biological warfare shown to all at the General Assembly of the United Nations?
Do you all know what he's talking about there? When Colin Powell showed the proof of,
yes, okay. No, as we already seen, fake news is not a new phenomenon. What's new is the dangerous elixir where emotion, magnification, speed, and information overload meet in an astonishing contemporary cocktail.
An astonishing contemporary cocktail. Okay, so emotions, magnification, speed, information overload, just exactly what you mean by emotion.
It is the great adversary of journalism, that one that privileges fake news is emotion or feeling. Emotion levels everything, becomes a parasite on analysis, and prevents the journalists from establishing a hierarchy.
So emotion reduces everything to the same level.
Yeah.
Give us an example of that.
Yes, I have a clear memory of two new news stories 2 days apart, in which two reports struck me by their similarity in form and in tone, but where the essence of the stories were completely and dramatically different. In the first story, a woman in the south of France who had lived through a flood in her town appears in her kitchen showing the height of the water has reached. In tears, after pointing out that all her appliances had been ruined, she says, "I've lost everything."
Our appliances have been ruined
Yes.
by the war.
Now, in the second story, a woman in Bosnia who lost her husband and her son in a bombing, in tears, she turns to camera and says, "I've lost everything." They use the same words, the same shattering cry of pain, but two news items of completely different dimension. Two news stories whose goal was to evoke the compassion of the viewers. Two stories where emotion dominates, but in which we lose the true sense of value, the loss of appliances on one part, as opposed to the loss of life to the other part.
It's a dramatic example, but it seems to me, nevertheless, that emotion has always played a role in journalism.
Yes, but in the beginning, in the print journalism, emotion played a small part. Then with radio, it got more important. The arrival of live coverage, as in sports, made the spectator tremble with excitement. Then it came into full bloom with television. At first, the shock of the images, and then what we call in French the micro-trottoir, that is interviewing the men in the streets.
Interviewing the man on the street.
Yes, the man on the street. When the practice started, it was a good thing, because previously the news was cold and institutional, and that new form of expression allowed us to take the temperature of public opinion. But after a while, it became a complete calamity. Emotions soon began to tyrannize the news. Now, with social media, we have arrived at the paroxysm of emotion in full splendor. As an example, I would like to make a short personal digression based on my personal experience. In 1981, a socialist president, François Mitterrand, was elected in France after 23 years of conservative rule. At the time, I was the editor-in-chief of a television news broadcast in Nice, and I personally experienced this change as a revolution. A word at the time was change. The news, which until then had been very institutional, suddenly trust its doors and windows wide open to great life, true life itself. My team of journalists and I were very enthusiastic. But when I look back on it today, I think that even if that movement was positive at the beginning, unfortunately, it quickly went to the other extreme. The FIDA in 1991 in France, there was only 81, sorry. In France, there was only 3 public channels, Then suddenly, in the appearance of the CNN in the US,
CNN appeared in the US in 1980.
yes, the landscape of the television news was irrevocably changed. Several all news stations appeared in France. Here again, it was at first a good development, but soon after they became the precursor of the loss of journalistic credibility, the domination of the short form reporting, 75 seconds devoted to the Middle West, for instance. Middle East, sorry.
10 seconds.
Yes, yes, loop repetition, the importance of faits divers. Faits divers, that is the stories of shooting, natural catastrophes, fires, etc. That becomes a new form of entertainment. We call it infotainment, and this word is also used in French. The final stage of this evolution is to be found in the profession of experts and pseudo-experts who are called in to comment this event. Too many people speaking on too many different topics have the effect of reducing credibility.
Okay, you explained about emotion, but let's get back to this question of the elixir. You mentioned 4 different parts, and after emotion, you said came amplification. What do you mean by amplification exactly?
Well, that's where the social media comes into play. They provide an enormous sounding board of amplification. It is in the nature of crowds with their attraction, but also with their risks. Attraction, enthusiasm, and crowd sourcing. Risk, panic reaction, anger, lynching, bashing, etc. And I want
As was pointed out
yes,
earlier,
yes,
that this was a real risk.
and I want to quote Kierkegaard about that. The quote: "The crowd is untruth, while the individual is the awakening of the spirit."
Crowd.
The crowd is untruth,
While the individual is the awakening.
yes.
So what was the third ingredient of the elixir?
It is the speed. The speed was new in the speed of transmission of the news. It's also the number of people reached. We live in a societal speed of instantaneous. With their live on the spot coverage, the all news station broadcasting 24/7, and the social network like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, now more than ever, the rallying cry of the media is faster, faster, faster,
Faster, faster, and faster.
yeah. We must there remember the importance of getting it right instead or before that, or getting it first. Finally, the last point is what I call infobesity, that is information overload. People are surrounded by stories, Twitter, Facebook. There's no time for critical reflection. Information overload can also be a deliberate communicative strategy that could be used in news-driven cyber war. Infobesity makes it impossible to establish a hierarchy and renders analytical distance impossible. I remind the old proverb: if you can convince them, confuse them.
If you can't convince them.
Convince them.
Confuse them. So we understand that
Yeah.
the elixir is a poison. Actually, it's a little like getting dust from my phone. That's my own aside. You don't have to comment. The elixir is a poison. Fake news has infected us. Do you think journalists have an antidote?
Well, it's very difficult to answer this question with any kind of certainty. The very problem of speaking about fake news, that is precisely to speak of fake news. For example, if you tell me a rumor that I have never heard anything about, first I am infected. Then, when I pass it on, I become the next instrument of the rumor transmission, the vector. That is why, as a journalist, it is so important to choose which fake news story you will work in. For instance, when President Trump denies climate change, it is absolutely necessary to attack him because this idea has already convinced so many believers.
And also because it's so dangerous.
But
Let me say something though.
yeah,
Because here, I think this is interesting. You use the metaphor, by the way, this part is on script. It just occurred to me. Okay? Because as we're reading this, it says, when you tell me a rumor that I have never heard anything about, I am infected, then when I pass it on, doesn't it sound remind you of AIDS? I wonder if we would have used the word viral if AIDS had not existed. You think we would have?
Yeah, communicable disease was something that was cholera actually in London, I think. We started talking about.
I'm not just simply talking about the linguistic aspect of this. The fact of the use of the word viral in this particular context. Okay, because what we're saying is the internet is a connected system of interconnected bodies, and that we can infect it. So anyway, okay, I'm sorry.
well, I would like to give an example, a video that was viewed more than 1 million times with the headline, "Mainstream media doesn't want you to see this." The video showed someone who was identified as an immigrant brutally beating the nurses in an hospital. In reality, this was an old video of a Russian drunk in a hospital in Siberia. By the way, this is a true story. And for one last example that is closer to us here in New York, concerns a story about Russian hacking the power system through an electrical grid in Vermont. This was an error made by the Washington Post, but it was picked up by Agence France Presse and spread throughout Europe. The British journalist Greenwald, writing on the online magazine The Intercept, commented that the story, although it might seem trivial, is in reality important, and here I quote Greenwald, because it reflects the deeply irrational and ever spiraling fear that is being cultivated in the US political discourse and culture about the threat posed by Moscow. Here I have 3 remarks to make. First, the press is in reality not exempt from error, but at last the press recognizes mistake, correct it, and apologize. President Trump has never made a mistake, nor has ever apologized.
Nor has he ever apologized.
Second, fake news has a viral potential 6 times more potent than a corrected news item. False news stories are more widely and more quickly shared than the true ones. Third, I would like to say that fake news is binary, while the journalist work is more finely shaded. The criteria of like and share on Facebook doesn't apply to journalism. Journalism is contextualization, dot, research, contradictory version, all of which create a certain shade of meaning. In reality, this leads to us to the difference between making judgment and reasoning. To judge is binary, to think is complex, because the more one thinks objectively, the less one exists. In the political news class, the craze for judgment overrides far too often the concern for understanding. Judging is quick and easy, thinking is long and tiring. I wonder if people often demand freedom of expression compensate for freedom of thought that they would rather avoid.
So it's a pretty sick state of affairs.
Work.
Viruses everywhere. Was there any remedy? Do you think there's any remedy for this?
Yes, work. One of the leaders of the Washington Post, Cameron Barr, explained how, when faced to the question of truth versus alternative facts, he wanted to take up Trump's challenge, and I quote, "To start a fight with him would be to fall into a trap. We adopted a motto that says it all. We are not at war, we are at work." And I think it's really very.
We're not at war, we're at war.
We have to consider that we are suffering from a form of moral panic. We are living something far more widespread than the Trump phenomenon. This is not only the shattering of the news as such, it is a global crisis. What it means to inform. We must use the arm at our disposal, and first the language. We must begin by ceasing to speak about fake news. We should be speaking about trust rather than truth. Words, our own words, have been turned against us, those who have declared war against journalists, by those who have declared war against journalists. Trump also speaks of fake news. In reality, we are experiencing a kind of conceptual bankruptcy. In all of this, the social media must accept the burden of their responsibility, because in the algorithm of Facebook, there is no objective way to speak of things. The loss of contact with reality, the now famous divorce of the elites, from the masses, today haunts the press and democracy alike. Journalism is shaken to its foundation, and the morality of its practice is far from explaining the scope of the crisis. In fact, and we all see this, the news has never had as many different demands as it need, as many ethical codes, as many critical accusations, and all of this is good for the people. The news is rediscovering the virtue of talking an offensive position of interview, of total immersion in the situation, also of humility when confronting witnesses, ordinary people who know, publish their own stories themselves. But the question of responsibility remains: whose fault is all this? Could it be Truman Capote with his non-fiction novel like In Cold Blood, or Tom Wolfe, perhaps, with his Bonfire of the Vanities? Maybe it's because of the philosopher, Derrida following Nietzsche, or the gang of French theorists, not terrorists, theorists. French. On this last point, my friend Bill Cipolla will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone would like to ask questions? We have some couple of minutes still. Yes.
I have a very slow and clear. Slowly and clearly.
Okay. When you were talking about complexity and perception of public, I have a very European question to ask you, right? And the question sounds very odd, perhaps, but in your opinion, is Angela Merkel an absolute oddity, or is she an indicator of the future? Because she's one of the few long-duration politicians who also happens to be a quantum chemist. There's a very unusual case. Most leaders in the world are very uneducated, right? Exceptionally in the US, Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer, lasted one term, right? Only one president in the US had a PhD. 2 had MBAs, right? The rest haven't had graduate degrees. Angela Merkel is a quantum chemist. She's a long-standing politician in Germany. It's a very weird phenomenon because most people who are in positions of power do not have advanced degrees. They don't like complexity or don't seem to like complexity.
So,
Yeah. Do you think Merkel is one of a kind? connotation surpreneur ou c'est une indication du, you know, I don't know, like a trend in the future, you know?
Yes. More and more the presidents and the leaders have less and less knowledge. Less and less.
This is why I'm asking the question.
No, what he's saying is the leaders are becoming that the leaders are becoming less and less.
I mean, so, and she sort of bucks the trend. You know, if you look at the other leadership in Europe,
But I think they can do that for a long time.
right, which is sort of very unusual because when it does happen that someone who is of a very advanced degree does come into power, they tend to be there for a very short time usually.
Let's not forget the Macron also.
Yeah. Yeah.
Macron.
Macron, yeah.
Macron, well, Mitterrand was really very
And there, you know, there's a concept in French of being cultivated.
cultivated.
Cultivated means more than being educated.
Right.
But
Broadly.
Sarkozy doesn't read. Sarkozy
Yeah.
avoid, he never read La Princesse de Clèves or read classic books.
His example is the first psychological novel written in French in the 17th century. That's what Sarkozy never read.
Right, Sarkozy never read. Hollande never read. Never. The minister of the culture avoid that she couldn't read. She has no time to read. This is a drama. Yeah.
But this speaks exactly to the question of complexity, right? This is exactly it. That if we have, if the public consistently chooses leaders that do not have that background in complex reasoning, it seems to be an exception that they do appear at all.
How the leaders could be cultivated when the people begin to be less interested. We see that the people are interested in the infotainment, but not in the information. I say the people, c'est pas méprisant.
It doesn't need to be contentious.
Right. But we see that we become more and more superficial, okay? And we don't want to see the complexity of the world. It's too tired. I told you that judging is easy. The people in the street or on the social media judge, but they don't think because it's too tiring, and complexity is too tiring for a lot of yes.
Okay. I just want to say something about this as a response to and it's not something that we rehearsed or anything. It's just this, that when we talk about the public becoming less and less well-educated, less and less cultivated, we have to remember this in the context of the movement that has been identified in American culture, let's say in the last 35 years, which is a movement that Chris Hedges calls the movement from a culture of literacy to a culture of spectacle. His book came out in 2011, was called The Empire of Illusion, where he points out the loss of literacy and the rise of spectacle. But there's and that, of course, what that means is that we look at screens nonstop. The screen that we're surrounded with, we're all carrying two of them around with us. So the screen is this image, and the image is playful, it's ludic. But what I mean to say here is that we all learned to read words. No one ever taught us to read images unless we were art history. We think that pictures speak for themselves. They don't, because they're filled with their own discourse, their own conventions, their own subtleties, their own gaps, their own plays between negative and positive. You have to learn to read that. So the more we move, we shift to a culture which is based on images rather than words, without teaching people how to read images, the dumber people get.
Can I ask you a question about this? Sorry, this is just a really, really interesting insight you just mentioned, because it begs the question, should universities that are creating or adapting core curriculums, should we create a new category of critical image literacy? We are so fixated on verbal literacy being a criteria for a good core. Look at Columbia's score, Harvard score.
Called visual literacy.
I want to tell another thing, that I am, as a journalist, I have a problem with the complexity, because, as I said, we are on short formats.
Yeah.
And you can't explain the complexity.
Absolutely.
in a short form. So, we entraîne les gens vers la.
So we lead people toward these young.
Yes, it's a terrible problem. Because, and sometimes when there's a debate on the French TV, the moderator, the journalist says, okay, we are, the emission is finishing, just 10 seconds, what do you think about the war of 10 seconds? It's ridiculous. And Bourdieu told us that he doesn't want to go at the French TV because he wanted to have the time to explain the complexity, to explain the things. And, well, par ailleurs, on ne peut pas réduire la complexité à quelque chose.
And besides, we can't reduce complexity to something.
It's impossible. So the
Complexity is what can't be reduced.
il y a un problème fondamental.
Yes, while accepting your suggestion of image literacy, I thought we have to move from the semantics of the image to the pragmatics of the image. What it does to us is more important than what it means. Perhaps that dynamism of the image moving and doing something.
I would say we have to move to how the image does something to us. How it does.
Not
Like
what
the
it
question-
is,
the
rather
question-
than what it is, what it does.
The
Perhaps
old
it's
question
the,
in poetry always
the way
was
of looking.
that we don't ask the question, what does it all mean? We ask the question, how does it all mean?
I would like to invite my colleague Professor Alavaeva, the cinematic philosopher here. So maybe tomorrow morning, we have a few minutes there, maybe overnight to think about it. And tomorrow morning, we have about 15 minutes if we could just talk about it. He's the cinematic philosopher who engaged in that kind of thinking. And very much you connected with you in terms of looking at the algebraic ways of what we did this morning for the keynote. You missed it. Fuzzy math. She is also a mathematician, so she comes from mathematician to filmmaking, so she brings that.
When we were talking about the temperatures, I was just thinking how many years ago in science we were discussing also true facts, not true facts, and the answer was always like, try to jump from the window and experience that metaphor, and the result will be the same. From the scientific point of view, the result is the same. When you're jumping from the window from the like high scrambler, the result is always the same, even if you call it as a metaphor.
So all of the things have to come to an end, but they're not ending. Just about. First of all, thank you very much for spending the whole day with us. And Dean has been kind enough to invite you all for a little dinner at Hibachi. And Hibachi is going to walk for about 5 minutes or maybe 8 minutes from here. Ola, you know where Hibachi is? No. All right. So I guess you have to wait for me. Mark, you know where.
I know where it is.
Okay, so Mark will be the front leader, and I'll kind of tell you off so that you can jump that now. University has its own restrictions, so whatever alcoholic beverages will not be covered. So you will take that.
Tomorrow.
That's
Tomorrow. Oh, so next week. Have a nice time. Are people sick?
It might be the other way. No, yeah, pull it. Yeah, yeah.
Just found that.
No,
Thank you.
That did so much.
At least people don't have to struggle with the door.
Which door do I open? Of course, it's great when I'm trying to like go out during class and I'm just like.
Just fiddling with the door back and forth.
Okay, now I have to go to the city.
Oh, enjoy.
No, I have to go for work.
Oh no.
Yeah, I know. Don't go into broadcasting.
Enjoy evening.
Is the recording?
Yes, we are.
I know you. So I gotta have you. Huh? How are you? Yeah. All is well?
Kind of.
Right. Everything is going?
Very promising.
Yeah, so it starts.
That's okay, no, it's because
So, I had it.
It's good to see you.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for being
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And this is from here. Yeah, from the university. Yeah.
Thank you. So wait here for me and.
Sure.
Yeah. No. Have to
Well, no, I was not, I'm here when you guys, okay, but they're dying.
We did give them access to the information from the university, and it's training the Watson. But you designing the
We're just
designing.
The majority of the time, about framing the model itself for trying to